I think when you are looking at Britain, it's really important to think of it as in breadth. It is the breadth topic. So if you can kind of see the bigger picture, it will help you understand the economy much better. Because when we look at Britain, the students get really stressed about it because a lot happens between 1918 and 1979. And there is a stress that you have to know absolutely everything that happens in between those years. And if you want to understand and be able to put it together and be able to recall it, you need to be able to kind of construct a narrative and think in the long term and the wider picture, wider context about what actually is going on in the British economy. So having just said that, I thought what would be useful, first of all, if we think about the British economy, if you could, right, you're under stress, you've got a question in the exam, it's 1918 to 1979, the economy. If you had to come up with just five events, economic events, what would you pick to try and pad out the narrative of the British economy? Okay, if you can, unmute yourself. Otherwise, type in some of the events that you think would have to be there if you were going to talk to someone about the British economy 1918 to 79.
The Depression.
Right, the Great Depression 1929. Let's add that one in. Definitely, that needs to go in there. We'll talk about it in a minute. So we've got one. Any other suggestions? Definitely. That was I got three pretty quickly, and Great Depression and Return to the Gold Standard 1925 were both on that list. So we've got two. We need three more.
The General Strike.
Good. 1926 General Strike. That was the third one on my list. Now it gets a bit trickier. We need two more.
The Winter of Discontent in 1979.
Let's go with it. Gives us a bit of chronological breadth then. Not that that's important, but gives us a bit of a breadth. We need one more. And while we ponder which one we are going to come up with, I think this is hard. Just thinking of five economic events is tricky. Why? Because if I asked you, five political events or five pieces of legislation, I think that would come much easier. So when we're thinking about the economy, why can't we just rattle off five events off the top of our heads? Letitia, why do you think?
I think that the economy is slightly more complex than just like the political stuff. I just don't know. I find economy harder.
Yeah, and I think because you haven't got those kind of core dates to base it around. And I think also the economy, it's a series of processes, isn't it? It's not about events. It's about periods of time and what's happening in those periods of time. So actually, events with the economy aren't very important at all. We still haven't got the fifth one though. Let me think. I mean, you could. Oh no, put that in. You could come up with another strike. I suppose you could come up with the 1972 strikes. I'll tell you what, let's go with 1922 Geddes Acts. those expenditure cuts, we'll fill it out with that. So instead of kind of focusing on key events, we now need to explain this graph, which I attempted to do the other day, to try and explain the British economy. Okay, there are 4 of us here, and there's 1, 2, 3. Oh, there are 4. In fact, I did put another date in there of 1964. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to take the first one. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain what these kind of peaks, this line graph, I'm going to narrate the economy between 1921, or 1918 really, and 1929. And I'm going to try and use as many of those core phrases in my right-hand box, okay? And then you're going to have a go. So if we start in 1918 and think about what was going on in the British economy, we've got a lot of pent-up demand, just coming out of the First World War. And so we see this initial boom. People go out and spend in 1918, but it's an artificial boom, because actually by the time we get to 1920, the boom ends and Britain goes into recession. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, the pent-up demand is not going to keep continuing. It's a short-term effect of the end of the war. But also, Britain's trade has been disrupted during the First World War. Those trading routes, their core markets, have often gone and looked for alternative markets because Britain's economy has been geared to the war. So they simply can't fulfill the export market that they had in 1914. There's going to be an adjustment. We've also got, as demand starts to decrease, we start to get rising unemployment. And if we think, they gave them that very generous out of work donation, didn't have to, it wasn't means tested. It was given out to men that weren't in employment. Primarily, again, context is really important here. We've got the Clydeside riots. That could have been one of the events that we picked up in our 5. There's this fear of revolution. You've got a lot of men coming back from the front, disenchanted with what life in post-war Britain is actually like. So they give them this very generous out-of-work donation. So rising unemployment, we've got disrupted trade, but also, and this is going to be a common feature of the 1920s, is that Britain has been really dependent on its core staple industries that got it through industrialization, that gave them that head start in the first place. Things like cotton, coal, the manufacturing industries. But 20th century Britain and the 20th century economy worldwide is changing, and Britain isn't keeping up with those changes. It's too dependent on those staple industries. So what we see in the 1920s is this failure to mechanize. And the best example of that is in the coal mines. If we think, they went back into private ownership at the end of the First World War. Private owners didn't invest in them. They're still cutting out coal by hand. So they're not very efficient. And then we start to see, building up to the general strike in 1926, we've got more strikes. And the government just doesn't know how to respond to these problems. They don't understand some of the issues, some of the economic issues, because traditionally the government's role has not been in regulating the economy. So in that second phrase, we've got structural and cyclical unemployment. Cyclical, it comes and goes. It's a natural phenomenon. It comes with, if we've got periods of recession, then you'd have more unemployment. And then as the economy grew, unemployment would fall. But this is structural. There simply aren't the jobs out there. It's not to do with peaks and troughs in trade. It's a more fundamental problem with the British economy. And unemployment is consistently a problem through the 1920s. So I suppose also you could add onto debt as well on that. I'll tell you what, one thing I didn't mention, of course, which we did talk about, that event, Britain abandoning going back onto the gold standard, sorry, which compounded Britain's trading problems because it made Britain's goods more expensive. So that's kind of taking the economy from 1921 to 1929. Letitia, do you want to take us from 1929 to 1939? What's going on in the economy there?
Well, the trade deficit's quite high. The May Committee said it might get as high as £120 million.
Yep.
So the Labour government got split over whether they should promote cuts, and then you went on to the national government.
Okay, let's step back slightly.
Yeah.
Why are they having to make expenditure cuts? What's happened in 1929? Have a look in our chat.
The Great Depression.
Brilliant. Right. So that's really defined. That's why I kind of put that key date in. If we're going to chunk up the economy, 1929 is an absolutely crucial point, and it's from that point then we get the cuts, which you quite rightly mentioned. So we've got the cuts, we've got the split in the Labour government, then we go into a national government. So keep talking to me about what's going on in the economy.
Then you went on to the national government, which implemented like cuts in salaries across the board, including welfare. And they kind of had the idea that the economy would eventually right itself.
Yeah.
So then they were aided by the growth of new industries like car manufacturing and household appliances.
Brilliant. That's what I wanted you to get. So that's when we start to see this upward turn. I mean, I've put it as the lowest point, 1929, the economy, but then up to 1939, we do see this upward turn. And you're quite right. We've got this development of light industries. Is there anything else you think that's making the economy recover? Because the government is being more interventionist in this period to try and right the economy. Any other industries that they're investing in?
Rearmament.
Good. Yeah. So we've got defence. You mentioned light industries, electronics, also the housing market as well. So there is a big housing boom. And if there's a housing boom, that's obviously going to have a knock-on effect on light, household appliances. Just thinking about that period, 1929 to 1939, we always need to remember that we're looking at the effects of the economy kind of very broadly. But whenever we think about that, we have to think about how the economy is impacting on different parts of the country. And the 20s, or the late 20s, and definitely the 30s, are a really good example of how you get this division, this economic division happening in Britain. And really, the effects of that remain in place, arguably, until today. So you end up with the manufacturing, the heavy industries of the north, South Wales. They're the areas really hit by the lack of mechanisation, by the effects of the Great Depression. But the light industries and the housing, that's really benefiting, particularly the Midlands, the Southeast. So we get this growing division. Okay, right. We're not going to talk about the impact of the Second World War. Let's think about, so 1945 to 1951. It's a really short period. Hannah J, can you unmute or not?
Yeah, I can.
Well done. What's characterising the economy between 45 and 51?
Well, it was in decline because they weren't as they were in debt.
Good. Yeah.
And they were dependent on loans from
Good. Brilliant. Yeah.
Also, at that time, they had bad industrial relations. So there's lots of strikes.
Yes. Just going back to that debt, one of the things they're going to have to do to pay off the debt is they're going to have to export everything that they're producing. Now look at our key phrases in that right-hand box. What does that, if you're exporting too much and not importing enough, or importing too much and not exporting enough, what do you get? What's the problem?
A balance of payments, is it?
Yes, you're quite right. So we've got a balance of payments issue, 45 to 51. And this is all kind of tied up, isn't it, with the impact of the Second World War. To kind of the core word for 45 to 51 is austerity. And we've got rationing, because they're trying to pay off the debt. In fact, it's been discussed recently, because obviously coming the next few years, Britain's going to have an awful lot of debt. And they've been talking about in the press how they're going to pay this debt off, and they've done a lot of comparisons with the Second World War. And one of the reasons Britain was able to pay off their debt was it wasn't tied to, or large parts of it weren't tied to inflation. So as prices went up, the value of the debt stayed the same. So actually the whole debt actually decreased because inflation was going up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. But the problem the British government have got now is that debt is much more heavily tied to inflation rates. So they're not going to have the same benefits that they had in the post-war government. Having said that, even the debts to America, they only paid those off. I think the date was 2008. It's very recent that they paid off the Second World War debts. Right then, so we've got to 1951. I was going to put in an extra date, and I meant to, which was 1964. So, Lily, how would you describe the British economy between 51 and 64?
Didn't they focus on unemployment, so Keynesian style economics?
Yeah, definitely. This, you could say that Keynesianism is the dominant economic theory, certainly really from 1945, but we haven't mentioned it. So definitely it's about investing in the economy to control unemployment. The focus isn't on controlling inflation. So we've got dominant Keynesian economics. Is it a good period for the economy, 51 to 64? Relatively?
It's okay. It's not terrible, but it's overall doing better.
Yeah, think back to Harold Macmillan. What did he say about in the late 1950s? Anyone? I'll start the sentence off. Britain has never
Isn't it something like had it so good?
Yep, that's it. So 1950s, you get the end of rationing. You do have a buoyant economy. You've got a lot of consumerism driving the buoyancy in the economy. And he said, you know, Britain has never had it so good. It's known as the age of affluence. But Lily, you're quite right to kind of sit on the fence, because he then did go on to qualify that to say, but it's not sustainable. So we've got a core word coming up, stagflation, which is going to cropping up in this period. We've got an economy that isn't growing, and we've got rising inflation as well. And that's why we get Harold Macmillan's strategy of stop-go economics, artificially growing the economy, then it's overheating, and then you're trying to shrink the economy down, because if you've got an overheating economy, you get rising inflation. So you get this, if you remember, we talked about it as being like a balloon. You blow up the balloon, but then you don't want it to pop, so you have to deflate it. And that's a really common theme through the late 1950s and going on into the early 60s. So 64 to 79, what's the dominant themes? If we've gone from austerity, we've gone to affluence, what's dominating the economy from 1964 to 1979? Holly, if you can unmute, do so. Otherwise, do you want to just put it into the chat, what you think are the kind of the dominant aspects of the economy then?
There is like a lot of trade unions becoming more like powerful and challenging the government.
Excellent. Yeah. Keep going then.
And there is like rising inflation and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's why I was going to make the link between, we've got increasing industrial relations disputes, and that's happening because we've got rising inflation and their wages aren't keeping up with the pace of inflation. So we're starting to see the breakdown of Keynesian economics. And I tell you what, if we wanted another date to add in, probably 1976 IMF loan would be a really core date for this, because that's when they really abandon Keynesian economics. Their hand is forced by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, because they're told, if you want loans from us, you're going to have to control your spending. So therefore, they've got to abandon Keynesian economics. But already, you start to see chancellors like Denis Healey, I think it's Denis Healey, says the option of spending your way out of a recession no longer exists. Right, let's just check whether we have used all of the phrases. We've gone through, we talked about inflation, unemployment, stagflation, boom, debt, mechanisation. Right, the only one we haven't mentioned is devaluation. Who is it that devalues the pound? Which Prime Minister?
Wilson.
Yep, excellent. Harold Wilson. This is really going to test you because I can't remember it off the top of my head. Does anyone know the date for the devaluation of the pound?
I think it might have been 1967.
Right. I'm going to go with that, Lily, because I can't challenge that because I'm not 100% certain myself. Why was it controversial? What did he say about the devaluation of the pound? He went on TV and he said something. Anyone remember?
Was it about the pound in? Was it the pound in your pocket wouldn't be affected?
Yes, quite right. I'm multitasking here because I am looking it up. When it was. I'm gonna have to look it up another time. Yeah, I think you're right. It is. Well done, Lily. It is 1967. Yeah, he said he basically was trying to be quite reassuring and say, don't worry, the value of your pound in your pocket is still worth the same amount. And people said, well, quite clearly, it's not. And it provided that initial boost for British exports. But again, what we're seeing, and it's a common theme throughout the whole of the 20th century, is that government strategies really only mask slightly more fundamental problems within the British economy, whether that be inefficiency, too many strikes, failure to mechanise, not exporting enough, importing too much. And they really don't get to grips with those problems in the 20th century. And when we look at the economy as well, we have to remember that we are comparing it against other countries as well. So even in periods of growth in the post-war era, their growth rates are nowhere near the growth rates of other countries, particularly countries like West Germany, whose economy is massively growing in this time period. We are not keeping pace with the growth of other countries. Okay, right. Anyone got any questions?